Whenever you look at a giant, ancient tree, have you ever just stopped and wondered, where did all of that stuff, all that wood, bark, and leaves actually come from? Well, the answer is one of the most incredible processes on Earth, photosynthesis. It's how plants literally build themselves out of light and thin air. And believe me, the story of how we figured that out is just as amazing as the process itself.
It sounds completely impossible, right? I mean, how can something so solid, so heavy, be made from invisible gases and sunlight? Well, that is the exact mystery we're going to unravel together. We'll kick things off with a detective story of how scientists first cracked the code, then we'll zoom way in to see the tiny machinery at work, and finally, we'll talk about what it all means for life on our planet.
All right, let's get into that detective story. For centuries, nobody had a clue how plants grew. It was a total mystery. And the answer didn't just appear in some single eureka moment. Nope, it was pieced together, bit by bit, over decades by scientists who were running some seriously clever experiments.
Yeah, the solution took nearly a century to unfold. It all started back in the 1770s with Joseph Priestley, who figured out plants were doing something to the air. Then a guy named Jan Ingenhousz added two more huge clues to the puzzle. You needed sunlight, and it only happened in the green parts of the plant. And finally, in 1854, Julius von Sachs nailed it down, identifying what the plant was actually making, sugar. Let's see how they did it.
Priestley's experiment was so simple, but just brilliant. He'd take a sealed glass jar, and he saw that a candle would eventually burn out, and a mouse couldn't survive. The air was basically used up. But then, and this is the cool part, he put a mint plant in the jar with them, and what happened was amazing. The candle could stay lit, and the mouse was perfectly fine. That led him to a wild conclusion. Plants somehow put back into the air whatever breathing and burning take out.
So Jan Ingenhousz took Priestley's work and ran with it. He experimented with a water plant and noticed it was producing these tiny bubbles, which we now know as oxygen. But here's the kicker. It only happened when the plant was in the sunlight. And the bubbles only came from the plant's green parts. As soon as it got dark, everything just stopped. The clues were stacking up. Light and the green stuff in plants were absolutely essential.
Okay, so with those historical clues in our back pocket, let's zoom in, and I mean way in. We're going inside a plant cell, to the place where it all happens, the chloroplast. You can think of these things as tiny, self-contained solar power plants. This is where the real magic is.
The first stage is called the light-dependent reactions. And while the name kind of says it all, it only works when there's light. The whole goal here is to capture energy from sunlight and stash it in two special molecules, ATP and NADPH. Think of them like tiny, fully charged batteries, just waiting to power the next step of the whole operation. So how does the plant actually charge those little molecular batteries? It's this incredible high-energy journey. It all starts when a photon of light slams into a protein complex, hitting an electron and just blasting it to a super high-energy state. Now, the plant needs to replace that electron, so it does something amazing. It literally rips a water molecule apart to get one. Meanwhile, that supercharged electron zips down a transport chain until it gets to a second protein complex. There, bam, it gets zapped by another photon of light, which re-energizes it, giving it just enough juice to help create one of our battery molecules, NADPH.
And this is the most profound part of the whole thing. When the plant splits that water molecule to steal an electron, it's left with an oxygen atom it doesn't need. So what does it do? It just releases it as a waste product. That waste is the oxygen that fills our entire atmosphere. I mean, literally, every single breath you take is thanks to this one step, happening in trillions of leaves all over the world right now.
But what about that other battery, ATP? Well, as those electrons are moving down the line, they're also powering pumps that are shoving protons into a tiny sealed-off compartment. This builds up a ton of pressure, kind of like water behind a dam. The only way for these protons to escape is through this incredible molecular machine called ATP synthase. And as they rush through, they force it to spin like a microscopic turbine, and that spinning motion generates massive amounts of ATP. It's a perfect, tiny power plant. Okay, so the plant has captured a bunch of solar energy and stored it in those ATP and NADPH batteries. The power plant is officially up and running. Now it's time to use all that energy for the real mission, building food. Welcome to the sugar assembly line. This assembly line has a name, the Calvin cycle. This is where the whole building itself from thin air thing actually happens. The cycle takes the energy from ATP and NADPH and uses it to literally snatch carbon dioxide molecules right out of the atmosphere and turn them into a stable, energy-rich sugar. This is the process that creates the actual physical substance of the plant itself.
Now, the absolute workhorse of this assembly line is an enzyme called Rubisco. Its one and only job is to reach out and grab CO2 molecules from the air. And because this job is so fundamental to basically all life, plants make a ton of it. So much, in fact, that Rubisco is the single most abundant protein on the entire planet.
So, the Calvin cycle works in 3 main stages. First up is carboxylation. That's when Rubisco grabs or fixes a molecule of CO2. Next is reduction, where the plant cashes in all those ATP and NADPH battery packs to turn that fixed carbon into a simple sugar. And finally, there's regeneration. The cycle uses just a little more ATP to reset itself, so it's all ready to grab another CO2 molecule and start the whole process over again.
So we've got the process down, but it's not some one-size-fits-all system. Not at all. Plants have evolved different photosynthetic blueprints to deal with different climates, and the whole shebang is governed by some very real-world limitations.
You can basically split most plants into 2 big groups. First, you've got your C3 plants, like rice and wheat. They use that standard process we just talked about, and they're happiest in cooler, wetter places. But then, in hot, dry climates, you find C4 plants. Think corn and sugarcane. These guys have evolved a kind of turbocharged version of photosynthesis that gives them a huge advantage when it's hot and CO2 is harder to get.
And here's their secret weapon. C4 plants have a special leaf structure called Kron's anatomy. Kron's is just German for wreath. You can see this ring of special cells right here. These cells act like little pumps, actively forcing CO2 into the inner chambers where the Rubisco enzyme is waiting. This super concentrates the CO2, which makes the whole process way more efficient and cuts down on waste.
So what sets the speed limit for photosynthesis? Well, it all comes down to something called the law of limiting factors. The idea is really simple. A chain is only as strong as its weakest link. So if a plant has tons of light and water, but it's just too cold, then temperature is the weak link. It's the limiting factor. Pumping in more light won't make a difference until it warms up.
And check out this surprising fact. You'd probably think the limiting factor is almost always sunlight, right? But for most plants, it's not. They actually hit their top speed for photosynthesis, it's called light saturation, at just 10% of the brightness of full direct sunlight. Any light beyond that is basically just wasted. So if light isn't the limit, what is? Well, for a lot of C3 plants, it's carbon dioxide. The amount of CO2 in our atmosphere right now is actually a bottleneck for them. If there were more, they'd grow faster. But C4 plants, with their fancy CO2 pumps, they're so efficient that they're already running at full tilt with the CO2 we have today. And finally, temperature is the master controller. That whole Calvin cycle is run by enzymes, which are like these tiny biological machines that are super sensitive to heat. The enzymes in C3 plants are built for cooler weather, working best around 20 to 25 degrees Celsius. But the enzymes in C4 plants are built for the heat, hitting their peak performance somewhere between 30 and 40 degrees.
And all of this leads to a really critical modern-day question. This isn't just biology trivia. It's about our future. As our planet gets warmer and CO2 levels continue to change, which of these plant blueprints, the C3 or the C4, is going to thrive and which one is going to struggle? The answer is going to reshape everything, from the food we grow to the health of entire ecosystems.